building an effective and inclusive cash assistance program. And I am Tanya Ventura. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the Director of Service Provider Engagement and Education. And I have my colleague, Amy Durrance, who will also be presenting with me. She is the Director of Systems Change and Initiatives, and her pronouns are she, her, hers. Then I have a couple other FreeFrom staff who will be helping with the chat, with any questions that we can't answer. So y'all have a full, wonderful FreeFrom team on this call. So thanks y'all for being here. Okay, let's get going. Oh, I forgot to mention, there is a Q&A and a chat box. So it's two separate things. So the chat box, feel free to engage with each other. There'll be questions throughout. Feel free to answer each other's questions or offer support to one another in that chat box. But if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A box. So there's a separate button that says Q&A so that we don't accidentally miss your question in the chat box. And we will be sending out the recording and the slides after this session is over. All right, let's get going. So today we're gonna be talking about this amazing work that we want to share with you all and hope more people are excited by. We're going to start with an introduction to FreeFrom and then understanding the problem that we're trying to solve. We're going to talk about why cash grants, and there will be an opportunity to have some reflection in the chat box there. We're going to jump into the 7 steps to building an effective and inclusive cash assistance program. And then the challenges and implementation discussions. So we really want to hear from you all about what excites you, what sounds challenging, any feelings that came up during this session, and then we'll end with a Q&A. So a little bit about FreeFrom. If y'all have been joining a few of our webinars, I'm so sorry to repeat this. So this is mostly for the new folks. But we envision a world where survivors have sustaining income, savings, and credit with which to build wealth and the resources to support individual, intergenerational, and community healing. To that end, we are taking a holistic approach that uses data, technology, peer-to-peer networks, training programs, policy advocacy, social enterprise models, and cross-sector solutions to be able to support you all as advocates and service providers, but also survivors and our community. So let's talk a little bit about the problem that FreeFrom is trying to solve. So 1 in 4 women and 1 in 2 trans people will experience gender-based violence in their lifetime. And we also know that the #1 obstacle to safety for survivors is financial insecurity. It is extremely expensive to experience violence, and the CDC estimates that it costs a female survivor $104,000 to survive domestic violence. We also know that 99% of all survivors experience financial abuse. So what this all means is that experiencing gender-based violence and surviving gender-based violence is extremely expensive. So survivors can only secure long-term safety for themselves and their children if they can afford to rebuild and heal. What is economic abuse? This will be mentioned a little bit throughout, so I wanted to make sure that we all start on the same definition. So economic abuse are tactics that control the survivor's ability to acquire, use, and maintain economic resources, thus threatening the survivor's potential for self-sufficiency by creating financial dependence on the harm doer or another individual. It's all about control. So it's another control tactic in the power and control wheel. And it can be person to person. It can happen employer to employee. It can be government agency to constituent, and et cetera, et cetera. So why cash grants? So we're all here to talk about cash grants, and Sharon dropped in the link to our report. So I'm going to help us all get in the mind space to think about why cash grants might be helpful. So this is an opportunity to participate in the chat. So imagine you are getting 250 flexible cash grant dollars right now, whether you need it, whether you don't, whether you want to maybe hold off on it, but we're in an imaginary world right now and you're all getting $250. How would that help you right now? If you are comfortable sharing, please drop it in the chat box. Someone said pay off debt, birthday present for teenage son. Great. Support participants with transportation costs. Pay bills. Paying bills is nice, huh? Savings, that's a big important one. Upgrade your house. Yes, get that upgrade. Car repair. Wow. I love, love, love how $250 would be helpful to you all right now. I'm going to move on. Unfortunately, many cash aid comes with requirements and restrictions. So I'm going to read a few of these, and then you all, if some of these you are reflecting on and you want to write some reflections in the chat, please do so. And also, if I missed any, please feel free to jump in and add some. But typical requirements or restrictions are income. So a lot of them are income based. So you have to meet certain income requirements to be able to get it. So for example, the stimulus check has income requirements. Proof of survivorship. So this means some of them require police reports or having a restraining order. Some of them require that you are enrolled in social service programs or educational classes like WIC, parenting classes, workforce development. There's a lot of identification requirements, and some of them require you to have a social security number. Proof of purchase. So they'll give you money, but you have to submit proof of what you purchased, or receipts, invoices, all of that. Some of them only will do a direct payment to the vendor. And some of them have certain vendors or a vendor list that you have to use from. And some can only be accessed or applied for in limited places. So for example, you have to go, I don't know, to a government office to apply to a specific type of grant or cash aid. Are there any others that I missed here? Based on criminal records? Yeah, that's an important one. Thank you for reminding me of that. Income doesn't always take into account whether the survivor actually has a full access to that income. Very, very true. Citizenship restrictions, very true. Thank you all. And we'll definitely keep those in mind as we do more of this work. So now, knowing about all these restrictions, would any of these requirements or restrictions in the previous slide affect your ability to access or use those $250? And feel free to type in the chat. Even if one of those restricts it, that's a restriction. And said yes, a number of them do. Yes, proof of police report. Yes, income restrictions. At least two. Yeah. And I think that's something important to remember, that the folks that we support are also experiencing. They're having to navigate all these requirements and restrictions. And as exciting as it first felt to say, we're all getting $250, it can feel really discouraging and difficult to be told how or in what way you can access $250. All right. So some things that we're learning from this is from our first round of safety grants. So we gave out $250 grants to, I think it's about 3,000 survivors now. But we asked them, what are your top needs right now when it comes to how you're using this money, or what you need right now to get to safety. And the top three needs were cash to spend as needed. So 64% of those folks that received the grant and did a follow-up survey said cash to spend as needed. Then utility bill relief, and then credit or debt relief, which is some of the things that y'all mentioned in the comments. So we have many similarities with the folks that we support. And this is just a quote to kind of illustrate how direct cash grant doesn't always obviously have the most obvious connection to safety, but survivors really know what they need and how to use that money. And I think this quote really illustrates that. So I was able to pay my car payment without feeling worried. I was able to purchase a bed for my daughter too. It was the first time in almost 2 years where I felt free to purchase something without guilt. That feeling is what you most afforded me, some breathing room and a sense of normalcy. So we might not think, a new bed for a daughter can lead to a survivor feeling safe or financially well. But again, giving folks that flexibility honors their ability to make choices and honors the financial autonomy so that they can feel free and feel like they are doing the best that they can for what they need in that moment. Also, flexible cash grants are an effective and affordable solution. And what do we mean by that? So on average, survivors reported to us that they needed just $730 to get safe immediately. And on average, survivors estimated needing about $2,000, and that would enable them to stay safe for 59 days. So that's something that we can really start to think about as an effective way to get some immediate needs and crisis challenges met with cash grants. So why are we all here today? So we just did an activity. Hopefully I didn't break your hearts with all those requirements and restrictions, but there is hope. And that's why we're all here today to gather and sit with those uncomfortable feelings. But the Biden-Harris administration has pledged $5 billion to be used as direct cash assistance for survivors. And we know from the work that we do that survivors' #1 need is cash to spend as they see fit. So to help the Biden-Harris administration design a survivor-centered program, we asked an incredible diverse sample of survivors what they need. And this is what we found. So I'm going to hand it over to Amy, who will be going over the next parts of the presentation.
Thanks so much, Tanya. Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Durrance. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the Director of Systems Change Initiatives for FreeFrom. Super excited to be here with y'all today to present on this amazing and very important topic. So as Tanya mentioned, we've got this pledge of $5 billion with a B dollars by the Biden-Harris administration to be used as direct cash assistance for survivors. So maybe needless to say, we at FreeFrom were thrilled to see this pledge. And we also know through our firsthand experience in running our safety fund that dispersing money in a survivor-centered way is just as important as the cash itself. And so, as Tanya mentioned, in order to ensure that this $5 billion that was pledged by the administration is really dispersed in a way that is as survivor-centered as possible, we asked folks who received a grant from us through our safety fund, what is it that you need in a cash assistance program that would really work for you? And so we're going to talk through those findings, but first, and go ahead to the next. Thanks, Tanya. Let's talk about the survivors who shared this information with us. So we heard from the information we're about to share. We heard from 1,000 survivors from 44 states and Puerto Rico. And the survivors in our sample represent a really diverse range of genders, sexualities, and races and ethnicities. And in an effort to make completing our survey feel not only inclusive, but also affirming for folks, we provided a broad range of options for survivors to choose from to share their gender, their sexuality, and their race and ethnicity, including an option to self-describe. And we also, survivors were also able to select multiple genders, sexualities, and races and ethnicities if they identified as more than just one. So you can see here from this first graph, here are the genders that are represented in our sample. And I do want to say, I'm really going to cover these graphs at a really high level, but would really encourage y'all to go look at the report because there's a lot of really great detail there. But as you can see here, the survivors who shared represent 11 different genders. You can move on to the next one. And also represented 11 different sexualities. We can leave this on for a second to give folks a chance to take a look. But again, a lot more detail in the report. Okay. And then the survivors also represented 8 different races and ethnicities. And we also had an open-ended question for folks where they could self-identify the race and ethnicity. And we collected more than 150 unique identities in addition to what you see right here in this graph. So from these folks, we received really robust input about what they need in a cash assistance program that works for them. And we were able to put that input into 7 really actionable steps for how to build an effective and inclusive cash assistance program. Now, while these steps were really kind of directed, as we've mentioned a couple times, to the Biden-Harris administration about like, you know, this is how to structure this $5 billion to really make it work. Even though we really directed it towards them, these steps are useful for anyone who wants to create this kind of support for survivors. So whether it's private funders, state governments, on and on. So let's dive in. Step one, as you can see, give survivors options for where to apply for cash assistance. And so what we found, what survivors shared with us, is 71% of them were actually not seeking services at a domestic violence or sexual assault organization when they applied for a safety fund grant from us. So this really means that while DV and SA orgs remain an essential way to get resources to survivors, in order to make cash assistance work for everyone and be accessible to everyone, we've got to offer folks options for how to access the support beyond the traditional framework. And so in our survey, we gave folks, you'll see these 6 options for where to apply for cash assistance. And we asked them to rank them in order of what's the safest and most convenient for them. And you can see that survivors generally told us that this is the ranking that we got from survivors. Number 1, directly from the federal government, like a stimulus payment, tax refund, or on a TANA for EBT card. Number 2 is through banks or credit unions. 3, domestic violence and sexual assault organizations. 4, culturally specific community-based organizations. So for example, organizations that serve LGBTQIA+ folks and organizations or indigenous community groups. And we also offered post offices and pharmacies. And this is the ranking, yes, this is the ranking that we got from survivors, and it stayed pretty consistent across all demographic groups. And you'll notice our step 1 doesn't say make applications for cash assistance available only through the federal government. And Tanya, you can go to the next slide. And that's because there is no one-size-fits-all approach to dispersing cash assistance that's going to work for all survivors. And so here's a couple examples of what we mean. In the survey, trans survivors actually ranked culturally specific community-based organizations number 1, as did, you can see, indigenous survivors, and then came direct from the federal government, DVSA orgs, and banks. So we can't just have one solution. Additionally, we know that direct payments from the federal government are subject to economic abuse. We've heard from several survivors that their stimulus checks have been stolen by a harm doer. And some survivors don't feel comfortable with banks for good reason. They don't have access to safe bank accounts. So if we just go with one option for where survivors can apply for this cash assistance, we're really going to be excluding folks. So really what this means is, in order to make cash assistance really effective, we have got to provide survivors with a range of options for where they can apply for that cash assistance, and let them decide for themselves what makes the most sense based on their unique circumstances and needs. Move on to the next one. Okay, step 2, we're moving right along. Step 2 is to give survivors options for how to receive the cash assistance. You can move to the next slide, Tanya. Thanks. So in the same way that survivors need multiple options for how to apply for a grant, they also need multiple options for how to receive that cash assistance. So right here, we are sharing with y'all how we paid survivors through the safety fund. And you can see we offered a range of options like check in the mail, PayPal, Venmo, direct deposits, and then other like prepaid cards or JPay for folks who are incarcerated. And as you can see, there wasn't one option that was significantly preferred over the others. And it's because in the same way that there's no one size fits all approach to where folks can apply for cash assistance, there's no one size fits all approach for how to receive the cash. So like, for example, we heard from some survivors that direct deposits were really easy and convenient for them, while others indicated that a harm doer was monitoring their bank account, so that would not be safe for them. Similarly, some folks said that they'd rather have a check in the mail, while others said that a harm doer was monitoring the mail, and so they were worried that they wouldn't be able to get that grant safely. So again, it's all about providing survivors with options and letting them pick the best way for them to receive that money. Let's move on to the next. Okay, step 3, earmark a certain percentage of cash assistance funding for organizations supporting LGBTQIA+ and BIPOC folks. The next. So why are we making this recommendation? Well, first of all, we know, and I'm sure most people on this webinar know, that BIPOC and LGBTQIA plus folks experience greater obstacles to financial security. So as you can see here, we've shared some data, but folks have to contend with the gender income and wealth gap and the racial income and wealth gaps. And you can see some of that data here. So for example, for every dollar white men earn, Asian women are only 90 cents, Black women 62 cents, Native American women 57 cents, Latinx women are only 54 cents. And then when we look down at the wealth gap, it's even starker really. For every dollar for every dollar white men own, Black and Latinx women own only pennies, and Native American women own less than 1/10 of the median wealth of all Americans. You can go on to the next. Similarly, LGBTQIA plus folks have to contend with income inequality. These are just two examples, two data points that demonstrate this piece, but there's a range of other information and data supporting this. You can find a lot of that in our report. But for here on this slide, 21.6% of LGBTQIA plus folks experience poverty at a higher rate. LGBTQIA plus folks experience poverty at a higher rate compared to cisgender heterosexual folks. LGBTQIA plus folks experiencing it at 20.6%, while cisgender heterosexual folks experience it at 15.7%. And then here you can see that trans folks are 3 times as likely as the general US adult population to have an annual household income of less than $10,000. Move on to the next. And we learned from this survey, from this process, that survivors who don't identify as women, queer survivors, and Indigenous survivors are less likely to seek services from a DVSA org than others. So you can see here, survivors who identify as women were 2 times as likely to say that they were seeking services from a domestic violence or sexual assault org when they applied for one of our safety fund grants as survivors who don't identify as women. Heterosexual survivors were more than 3 times as likely to be seeking services from a DVSA org as queer survivors, and only 17% of Indigenous survivors were seeking services from a DVSA org, compared to 31% of survivors who don't identify as Indigenous. And it feels important for us to note too that we all know that there are instances of race-based, gender-based violence that cause even more costs and obstacles to financial security for survivors. And we saw a horrible example of this just this week in Atlanta, when a white person targeted and murdered Asian women. And so what does all this mean? It really means that, generally speaking, these groups need more support, and unless funding is earmarked for community-based organizations devoted to supporting BIPOC and LGBTQIA plus folks, survivors in these communities are going to be disproportionately excluded from this kind of support. Okay, step 4. Accept letters from friends, therapists, and advocates as sufficient verification that an applicant is a survivor. And Tanya kind of went over this with y'all in that exercise earlier, asking about, we're talking about common restrictions when it comes to this kind of support, and asking y'all about how those restrictions would impact y'all. So right here, we're really talking about what type of quote unquote proof someone has to submit to prove that they're a survivor. And so we're saying that you've got an effective and inclusive cash assistance program has to, at the very least, accept letters from friends, therapists, and advocates as sufficient verification that an applicant is a survivor. So 53% of survivors reported they don't have any proof that they are a survivor. 53%. So this means that right now today, the folks who responded to our survey, if they were applying for cash assistance and they were required to somehow prove what they had experienced, that they were a survivor, they wouldn't be able to get that support. So again, that's just over half of survivors would not be eligible. So we know at FreeFrom that the best practice is to trust and believe survivors. With our safety fund, we did not require anyone to submit any proof whatsoever of what they had experienced. They just had to self-identify as a survivor. We asked, are you a survivor? Folks said yes, they got the grant. But understanding that that's not likely to be the way that the federal government would disperse these funds, we asked some questions to survivors to get at what the best way forward would be when it comes to this proof or verification requirement. The next one. And so what we learned from survivors is these are the top 3 most dangerous and difficult verification options. So 79% of survivors can't or would not feel safe getting or sharing a letter from a religious leader. 69% said that they can't or would not feel safe getting or sharing a protective or restraining order. And 68% of survivors said that they can't or would not feel safe getting or sharing a police report. So if a program requires, that a survivor submit one of these forms of proof, look at how many folks would be excluded. I mean, it's pretty stark. Go to the next. We also asked folks to identify what would be the safest or easiest options for them. And as you can see, and this is where we got our recommendation from, 72% of survivors have or could safely get a letter from a friend, 66% have or could safely get a letter from a therapist, and 54% have or could safely get a letter from a DV or SA advocate. And I do just want to note, you know, we have in an hour, it's like we have a lot of information to get through, and I'm telling y'all, you've got to go to the report because it is chock full of data goodness. But I wanted to note here, even though we don't have a slide for it, we also sort of broke this down by demographics. So we learned that requiring certain types of proof will actually disproportionately exclude certain survivors. So for example, only 10% of trans survivors said they have a police report compared to 25% of survivors who don't identify as trans. And I'll say that one more time. Only 10% of trans survivors said they have a police report compared to 25% of survivors who do not identify as trans. So obviously the numbers are still really low for police reports. We don't recommend having that as the only way that folks can verify their experience. But you can see that it's even more stark for trans survivors. And just one more example, only 9% of Indigenous survivors said they have a protective or restraining order compared to 22% of survivors who did not identify as Indigenous. So you can see that not only is this just bad, generally it's going to be very exclusive, but in fact, it's going to have a disproportionate impact on certain folks. And again, I really encourage you to look at the report because we lay it all out there. So I guess I should, as a reminder, step 4, we really say, an effective and inclusive cash assistance program has to accept these easier verification options. So a letter from a friend, letter from a therapist, letter from a DVSA advocate. Okay, step 5, we are zooming right along here. All right, so limit eligibility requirements to an applicant's status as a survivor. So again, we kind of already talked about this with Tanya, right? These are what we're really talking about here are those other requirements that folks have to meet sometimes to get resources. Those other eligibility requirements beyond the fact that somebody's experienced harm. Of course, our recommendation based on what we've heard from survivors is that there should not be any more eligibility requirements other than the fact that someone has experienced harm in order to access cash. And that's how we at FreeFrom operated with our safety fund. You didn't have to show anything else, again, other than that you self-identify as a survivor. But you can see here from this slide that 84% of survivors would not be able to access cash assistance if they had to meet certain added eligibility requirements beyond their experience of harm. I'm like pausing because 84%. And, as I saw in the chat box when y'all were, when we were doing that activity with Tanya, it was similar for everyone on this call. Everybody was saying, yes, at least one of these eligibility restrictions or eligibility requirements would make it so that I would not be able to use a cash assistance. And so you can go on to the next slide. And so you can see here a more detailed breakdown of exactly what survivors told us. So we asked in our survey, we gave some examples, like how would these things limit your ability to use cash assistance? And just to call out the top three here, you can see that 64% of survivors said that they would not be able to access cash assistance if they were required to be enrolled in educational programs. So that's like, for example, parenting class. 48% indicated that they would not be able to use or access cash assistance if they were required to also be receiving public benefits. And then 38% said that if they had to have a proof of income and or employment, they wouldn't be able to access the cash. And I did just want to mention, someone made the great, amazing point in the chat box that, you know, sometimes economic abuse can be invisible on paper. So sometimes someone on paper can look like they're, you know, making a large income or have access to assets, when in reality, a harm doer is really controlling and limiting that survivor's access to those resources. So while on paper they might look like, for example, you know, maybe they don't receive public benefits because they can't prove that, you know, they don't have access to assets and other financial resources, but in reality, because of economic abuse, they can't access those resources. So I think that's a really important point to make. So again, this our recommendation, because of everything that we've just gone through, is that survivors shouldn't have to have any additional eligibility requirements to access this cash. And another point, and again, this is one that I'm hoping will send you to the full report, so you'll take a look at the full report. We also, similar to the proof or verification requirements that we just walked through, we also broke down the impact of these eligibility requirements across different demographics. And we found that requiring having more eligibility requirements to access cash, again, is going to disproportionately exclude some survivors. So to just give you two examples, trans survivors said that trans survivors are 4 times more likely to report that ID requirements would impact their ability to access cash assistance as survivors who don't identify as trans. And BIPOC survivors were more than 3 times as likely to report that requiring that they have access to a safe bank account would mean that they couldn't access cash assistance compared to white survivors. So not only are these added eligibility requirements going to make cash assistance less accessible across the board, they're in fact going to disproportionately exclude certain folks. And so that's why our step 5 is no added eligibility requirements. Move on to the next. And step 6, provide survivors with flexible, no strings attached support. And again, we really sort of talked about these kinds of restrictions with Tanya earlier during the exercise. You can go on to the next slide, Tanya. So we asked survivors, you know, if you, for example, had to you were only able to spend your cash at a certain list of approved vendors, would that impact your ability to use cash? We asked a range of those types of restrictions, and this is what we heard back from survivors. 52% report that having to submit receipts for their purchases would impact their ability to use cash assistance. So that's just over half. If folks had to submit receipts, they told us that basically that the cash would not have been as useful. They wouldn't have been able to get what they actually needed. It would have taken a lot more time, been a lot less convenient, or it could have even been more expensive than if they did not have to submit receipts. Similarly, 77% of survivors report that receiving gift cards limited to specific locations would impact their ability to use cash assistance. That's huge. That's over 3/4 of survivors said that cash assistance was not going to be as useful to them if they only received it in like limited gift cards. And in fact, one survivor specifically indicated to us, look, I live in a rural area. Like there there aren't a lot of options for me as far as shops go. I think that's an important point. And then you'll also see here that 67% of survivors report that payments made directly to third parties, so for example, landlords, would impact their ability to use cash assistance. So again, that they either wouldn't be able to pay for what they actually needed, it would be less convenient, or it would actually end up being more expensive. So what does all this mean? Survivors know best what they need and how to spend their money. And we really, to make a cash assistance program really work and really be effective and really be inclusive, we have to just give that money to survivors and trust that survivors know best how to spend that money. And I think Tanya shared a really good example of, someone who bought a new bed for their daughter, and that made them feel safe, and that's what they needed in that moment. And that person most likely wouldn't have been able to do that if some of these spending restrictions were in place. Another example from our first round of our safety fund, one survivor shared with us that they were able to use their $250 grant to repair their car. And while, as Tanya alluded to earlier, somebody on the outside looking in might say, well, how does that keep someone safe? How is that contributing to somebody's safety? Well, in this survivor situation, there was a court order that required that they meet the harm doer for custody visitations with their child. And without this person's car, they would be unable to meet those meetings. And that could have ended in further, for example, legal fees if the harm doer took this person to court, et cetera. So while it might not be obvious to others how a survivor uses their money makes them more safe, it's really not our place to make those decisions. Survivors know best, and we've got to trust survivors to be the ones to make those decisions. And finally, our step 7, ask survivors how much they need. So again, you might be catching on to a pattern here. Survivors know best what they need, and so really it's in thinking about how to structure this assistance. How much are these grants going to be for? We really need to root that decision in what survivors say they need. Now, of course, the best solution would be to be able to ask each individual survivor how much they need and give them how much they need. But barring the ability to do that, at the very least, it's important to get a sense from survivors, a range of how much they need, and really structure the grant amounts in that way, rather than just kind of picking a number out of thin air. And as Tanya noted earlier, what we've learned from survivors through our safety fund grant rounds is that on average, survivors say they need just $730 to get safe now, and around $978 a month to stay safe. And so those are our 7 steps that we put together after learning all of this really rich information directly from survivors about what they need to make cash assistance work for them. And as I mentioned, you might see some patterns across the 7 steps. And really what those are is that survivors need a cash assistance program that is steeped in flexibility and trust. They need options, and they need the ability to make decisions for themselves based on their own unique circumstances and needs, how best they can spend that money. So I think I'm going to turn it back over to Tanya so we can sort of have some more interaction and talk through these steps.
Oh, wow, I lost my voice there. Thank you so much, Amy. All right, so thank you all for being so interactive. I see that questions are getting answered in the Q&A and folks are engaging in the chat box. So here's another opportunity to engage. So what are some ways from what you learned today that you might be able to implement some of these steps in your work? And just as I want to mention that not all these steps will be relevant specifically to the work that y'all are doing, but maybe it inspired some thoughts on how you can create either cash assistance or maybe some sort of programs that you offer more accessible to survivors. So I'd love to hear from y'all in the chat box. Sorry, the chat box sometimes is hard for me to find on here when I'm presenting. Someone said we want to do cash assistance, guaranteed income programs for formerly incarcerated women. How did y'all decide on the 250 and where do you find the funds since so many grant makers restrict pass-through funding? Insert eye roll. I love the insert eye roll. So the 250 came from a few different places. One of them was that we learned that survivors on average do not have $250 in savings. And we know that savings can really help somebody avoid a crisis moment. So that's where 250 came from. But also there are restrictions that the IRS puts on nonprofits about how much direct cash they can give to folks. So $250 allows us to, if needed, give folks multiple rounds of cash grants, build their savings, build the things that they need to stay safe immediately, but also within, the IROL funding and government requirements that we sometimes have to deal with. And then the other question was, and where do you find the funds since so many grant makers restrict pass-through? So this was primarily funded through individual donors. So we launched a GoFundMe page, and I think it's super important to name that the way that you fundraise for certain programs allows you to do certain things. So we wanted to fundraise in a way that allowed us to be very flexible on how we got these cash grants. So we on purpose did not seek any government funding or any funders who would have restrictions on how we can distribute this money, how survivors could use this money, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why we went with GoFundMe. And I think I heard someone talking, but I wasn't sure. Someone want to jump in? No? Okay. Someone said, I love the suggestions of places to access the funds, such as post office. Yeah, it's a good one. Oh, sorry, it moved on me. We are working on how and where to be embedded in the community to be more accessible to folks who don't come to services in a traditional way. Yeah, that's really important because not everybody will feel safe going to like traditional services or places where traditional services are given. So that's a really good idea. Just creating more access points, right, to this type of support. We're doing a version of this in 2021 for survivors. We're also wondering about the amount to give. Do you recommend keeping it? Oh, sorry, every time someone types, it moves it for me. So keeping it flexible for family size. Do you recommend keeping it flexible for family size? I'm not too sure. Like, you mean the amount is based on family sizes, I'm assuming? I would say probably whatever works best for the survivors that you work for is always the rule of thumb when trying to figure out how much money you're going to give, how frequently, what that money is going to be dependent on. So doing some sort of focus group with the folks that you work or sending out some sort of feedback survey is a great way to kind of learn more about what might work best for them.
Tanya, we have a question. We have a couple questions in the Q&A that I want to read. The first
okay, go for it.
In was from someone who's anonymous, and it says, I'm totally on board with no verification grants, but wondering if you've developed any evidence base to show donors that survivors do not quote unquote abuse the funds.
What a fun question. Does anybody else want to jump in before I answer? I can go ahead. Okay. So I think this is one of those difficult places that one of the challenging and difficult places that we as service providers have to often navigate. This need for proof, this need for this worry that survivors are going to abuse funds, or in other words, don't know how to use the money that they will get. And that's really, really difficult. And that's what we're hoping that these grants show, because it shows that most of the people who got the grants are using it for things that funders might consider okay to use for, right? So like utility bills, paying off debt, paying rent, paying all these much needed services or products. So we're hoping that that's what these reports are doing. But I think that to us is evidence-based proof that survivors are not going to abuse these funds, because we're not seeing that. That's not something that's happening when we distribute this money. So I hope that that answer is helpful, and I hope that these reports are helpful so that you can start using some of the data in these reports to kind of make that argument as well. But I want to get to some ideas that folks are having. I know I missed a few. Places to go. Oh, I love that people are connecting to each other. Yes, yes, yes. Please connect to each other. Oh, I guess this is all y'all connecting to each other, so I'm not missing anything. Great. Okay. Should we move on to the next question? Okay, so what are some challenges with implementing these steps that you can forecast? So some of y'all are having some great conversations and knowledge sharing about some of those challenges, but so it sounds like IRS requirements is a big one, and I think someone offered a resource there. Let me try to open the chat box. But any others that either you're having a challenge with? I think some of the data that we found was also shocking for us to learn, but you know, it's gonna take some time for us to really start believing survivors as a society and start trusting what they need and what they're telling us. So I completely understand. And if y'all are like, I don't know how I'm gonna do any of this, or I'm just feeling overwhelmed, or I don't know if that's right. So please feel free to share any of those challenging feelings that are coming up for you, or any challenges that you perceive happening when you're trying to implement these steps. Staff capacity. Yeah, that's a big one. And we're a small team. We're a small team, and we do these safety fund rounds without a lot of planning. We're getting better at them. So I definitely feel you on staff capacity, but you know, we're tiny but mighty. And we can definitely share if you want to connect afterwards on how we kind of structured our staff around these safety funds. Any other challenges? How are we doing on time? Okay. Thank you. Any questions about anything that came up that maybe you're struggling to understand? That's a challenge in itself.
And actually, I'd like to throw out another sort of engagement question. Are there steps that you think we missed? Is there anything you think, wait a minute, what about this piece? What about that piece? You know, we'd love to hear from you about those as well. Anything that is jumping out like, oh, this is something that we should be thinking about to really make sure that this type of support works for everyone.
Was there a minimum age limit to qualify? I don't think so. Was there? Because we didn't ask.
I don't think we collected age. I don't believe we had anyone under the age of 18 apply.
But to clarify, the only requirements we had, which might be helpful, were that somebody identified as a survivor, and we gave a very expansive definition of what it meant to be a survivor, and that they had a way for us to get money to them. And I think that their name, I believe, was also a requirement. But so anything outside of that, I don't think was a requirement. Jumping into questions, I'm going to move on to the question. Okay, they're still sharing. So this is just a few ways that you can continue to work with us and contact information. So if you're interested in starting your own safety fund, you can definitely get some consultation or coaching from us. If you want to create survivor-centered workplaces, you can contact Amy. She's doing a lot of great things around how to create survivor-centered workplaces. And let me remind you that we at the Gender-Based Violence Movement are employers. So if you're employing people and you want to create a survivor-centered workplace, you can definitely reach out to Amy. If you want to support survivor wealth policy, you can contact Sabrina. If you want to help survivors start a peer-to-peer financial support group, you can contact M. If you want to train your staff on how to support survivors build financial capacity or security, you can email me. And if you want to help survivors navigate seeking compensation for the harm they endured, you can check out our compensation compass online. And let's get into these questions. Yeah.
And also I'm seeing a comment in the chat. Somebody said, we said that we had 44 states participate in the survey. This is a great question. Are there geographic deserts that you see who are not connected to services or this type of support? So as a point of clarification, this particular survey where we use the data to put together these 7 steps, had 44 states represented, but in our safety fund rounds, we've actually had all 50 states and DC and Puerto Rico represented. So for our safety funds, for folks getting direct cash assistance from us, we do have representations from all 50 states. It's a great question about resource deserts, and that's something that I think that we'll likely try to hone in on in maybe some future safety fund rounds, because that's a really great question and would be a really interesting and important thing to know and learn.
There's a question that I think is really interesting. The question is, we have had a really hard time gathering data and proof that the city is requiring when we give direct cash assistance. It's about 20 data points per person living in the home. Is there any advocacy being done around this barrier?
It's in
Sorry,
the,
Sharon,
I think.
Where is the question? I'm like trying
It's
to
in
look for it.
It's in the Q&A in the answered section. The first one.
The first one. Do that over there. Huh. So specifically asking about the barrier that, like a reporting requirement barrier is what I'm assuming, like data reporting about folks receiving. That's I think that's a great point. And yes, reporting requirement barrier. That's a great, no need to apologize. I just wanted to repeat it back to make sure that I was clear. Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And that is definitely advocacy that I think all of us in the movement can be doing when we're talking to funders, right? Is talking about how those kinds of things create real legitimate barriers to our ability to provide resources and support for people who really need it. So I think 17 pieces of paper to give out a $500 gift card. I mean, yeah, I think, again, I think that that's advocacy that all of us can be doing every time we talk to funders about this type of support. So that's a great point, Ashton. And then I also saw another question in the Q&A. Someone is asking, also on board with no verification grants, but wondering what about others, non-survivors abusing the funds available. So I think that basically, in our running of our safety fund grant, we didn't ask for any verification. So could there have been folks who weren't survivors lying and saying that they're a survivor to get $250? Maybe. And it would actually cost us way more and eat way more into the amount of money we have for direct cash grants if we went through a lot of anti-fraud verification processes. It would be staff time, it would be other resources. So we would actually lose more money doing the anti-fraud verification work than really probably most likely from the few folks that would be in that process. So I think that's really kind of our sort of take on that is those costs are actually going to be less than the significant amount of resources that we would have to expend to do really robust anti-fraud sort of work.
I have one question too that I had flagged, but just wanted to read this comment too from Lauren about broadly advocating to trust people more and err on the side of giving someone money and worrying so much about giving it to the wrong person. Love that comment. But there was one other question that came in through the Q&A. I know there was some things going on in the chat about taxes, but Amy, I was wondering if you could speak at all to, someone had asked, if a survivor accesses public benefits of any kind that are based on income, how have you worked to mitigate that impact that month? I don't want someone to lose a benefit if that cash pushes them over an income. And I was wondering if we had anything to say or comment on this in terms of policy perspective that you wanted to share about that question.
Sure, and this is something that we've got to add to our advocacy to the Biden-Harris administration about. This is sort of like the logistics and inner workings of it, but any sort of funds received as direct cash assistance should not count toward the asset limits for benefits or be taxable. Really, basically, just making sure that cash received doesn't have unintended negative consequences for someone in another area, or negatively impact other financial resources that that they have. And that was something that we really thought about when we were thinking about how much money we were going to make the safety fund grants. It's like, we need to be careful. We don't want to inadvertently cause someone harm in another area, accidentally make it so that they couldn't access other financial resources. So there does need to be advocacy in that any sort of assistance program like this has got to be really intentionally designed so that any of this cash is going to be treated, not going to be treated as assets, et cetera, when it comes to other public benefits. And that's a really great question. And before we go, I don't know if there's any other questions, but I did also just want to sort of mention and kind of, bring y'all in on it. Everyone's so engaged. It's like so amazing. And it looks like everyone's like excited about this type of support and wants to be able to give this type of support. VAWA, the reauthorization bill, passed the House. I think it was like yesterday or the day before. And there was no language in there for direct cash assistance for survivors. So all of us as a movement need to keep pressure on the Biden-Harris administration to make good on this pledge. It's not in VAWA, but it's got to come somewhere else. So I think that all of us, on this call and others, everybody in the movement and even beyond, we've got to continue to advocate for this type of support for survivors. And we've got to really hold the Biden-Harris administration accountable for their pledge. So I would just really encourage y'all in that way. And, please feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk more about what we're doing on that front, if you want to be part of that, those advocacy efforts.
Thank you so much, everybody, for such a great webinar. I am loving the resource sharing and community building that's going on in the chat. Please grab any emails that you haven't grabbed from the chat. I don't know if these get saved automatically, but I would hate to lose all this gold being dropped in the chat. But thank you so much for being with us here today. And if any questions come up, if you have any ideas, we do not want to be the only, I think it's important to mention that we are not the knowledge holders of this work. This work has been happening outside of the domestic violence movement with mutual aid funds and all of that. So there's a lot of innovative resources and ways to do this. And we'd love to hear from y'all. And please continue sharing with each other. Please continue to build community around these topics. And we are here to support you in any way that is meaningful. Thank you again. And you will all be getting a post email with a survey, the link to this, and the PowerPoint. All right, bye everybody.